So last episode we talked about Anthony Flew, who got convinced into deism by first stage arguments. This episode we're going to talk about Lee Strobel to start out, who is convinced of Christianity specifically in his case for Christ.
Yeah.
So he started out as an investigative journalist, very focused on evidence, atheist at the time. And Strobel's wife Leslie was converted to Christianity. And obviously when you have a home where the wife is Christian and the husband's atheist, arguments began, and he wanted to try to disprove her faith because he viewed it as kind of delusional. And that was a really his point of contention for them. So he started this quest to try to disprove his wife's faith. He started to research arguments for Christ's resurrection, for the validity of the Bible, which is really the foundation of the truth of Christianity. Jesus' resurrection is. And he realized that if Jesus really rose from the dead, if he really is everything that he said he was, he would have to believe what his wife believed. And he began to research, expecting to find no evidence for the resurrection. But over time, he described himself being faced with a torrent of evidence, including eyewitness accounts, the empty tomb, the impact of this event on the disciples. And these evidences combined convinced him of Christianity, reconciled himself with his wife's beliefs, and led him to write The Case for Christ, which was later adopted into a movie that I'm sure many of us have seen. Mm-hmm. So once again, this shows that, as we've been saying this entire podcast, apologetics is an amazing way to, strengthen your faith.
Yeah. So it's very interesting that Lee Strobel came to faith only from really third stage arguments. He didn't really have that belief in God prerequisite that many philosophers now insist upon having before they move to third stage arguments.
Yeah.
So third stage arguments can be very effective at just, skipping the middleman.
Getting right to it.
There are miracles that confirm this faith.
Mm-hmm.
That faith includes God, and, that works.
Yeah.
I will say that Lee Strobel, despite how much the evidence did help him bring him to faith, it was still that decision at the end. So, Again, apologetics isn't the only thing, but
it's important.
It is very, very important, like we went over in the first episode.
Yeah.
So,
hello, I'm Leif.
And I'm Micah.
And this is Faith Isn't Blind. We're the hosts of this podcast that's trying to get to the core of Christianity and discuss these ideas in a way that might help young people like us feel more confident in our faith. And today we are talking about third stage arguments, evidence for Jesus and his resurrection.
Of which there are primarily two.
Right.
There are others, but these are the two biggest ones.
Yeah.
And they're both very important to Christian doctrine as a whole. This first one, which Leif is going to talk about, is how Jesus claimed to be God, his radical, divine, personal claims.
Right. So C.S. Lewis, in many of his books, set up something called the trilemma, which is the idea that God is either exactly who he says he is, Lord.
Well, Jesus, but yeah.
Jesus, right. He's the Lord, he's a liar or a lunatic. Because if he's not what he says he is, then he's crazy or he's just lying to people, leading them on. So this is a very compelling argument for many people. But to avoid the trilemma, many critics of Christianity today have tried to introduce a fourth option, which is the idea that Jesus never even claimed to be God, that Jesus was a moral teacher, that all of his claims to be the Messiah, the Son of God, these are just misguided and maybe developed over time or placed back into the Bible by people in the future. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the, as Micah said, one of the top two attacks on Christianity, really. But it's not based on a lot of good evidence, in my opinion. First off, there's the early church. The early church from the very beginnings of when it started, even just, 5-10 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, was almost entirely committed to the idea of Jesus as God, as the resurrected God. And it's hard to imagine how that could have been so when most of these people knew God, knew Jesus, especially the disciples during that time. They knew Jesus. They were around with him. And you would expect that if all of these claims were being misconstrued or added back into the Bible, there would at least be a segment of the early church that were moral followers of Jesus, but not believers in his messianic claims, right? And we don't really see that significantly. We see that the early church was very convinced by Jesus' divinity and followed him.
We actually do see that, but just a lot later. So, you've got like Arians and other type of groups who view Jesus through non-divine lens, but it was actually a lot later.
Yeah, and you'd expect the opposite, really.
You would expect the opposite.
If he didn't claim to be Messiah.
In fact, the first heretical group didn't reject his divinity, it actually rejected his humanity. They were the Dostoevsky, I don't remember how to pronounce their name, but it's like Doe Stetics. Anyway, Paul talks about them.
Yeah.
But,
just an interesting phenomena based on the arguments that people are bringing up.
Yeah. So, in response to this, a lot of scholars, like Bart Ehrman, for example, or Stephen Meyer, these are like the two biggest ones, they sort of contest this point. And they try to say that, these claims are misinterpreted or late fabrications. And this sort of started a while ago when people just started to analyze the Bible very critically. So through this lens of historical scholarship, this idea that, the Bible, just like any document, is just open to historical criticism.
Yeah.
And I'm not too afraid of it, but very often this would be done in the spirit of trying to demythologize or de-supernaturalize the Bible and the gospel accounts, the New Testament specifically.
Yeah.
And I think that necessarily when you do that, because these documents are just inherently supernatural, or like talk about supernatural or spiritual things, not even if you don't believe that they are, supernaturally inspired or whatever. But like they're very obviously talking about spiritual and religious things.
Yeah.
And when you try and take that away and make this just a purely physical, historical narrative, you run into problems. And I think they are running into problems when they try and do that.
Yeah.
But anyway, talk about some more of the evidence. So how did the disciples come to this conclusion? So you said that they did come to this conclusion.
Right.
But how did they do that?
There's just a lot of different points of evidence. And you don't even have to rely on specific references of Jesus to being God. There's stuff about what he does and the cultural situations around him that lead to that conclusion. So
not just like the words out of his mouth,
right?
But
yeah.
the actions.
For instance,
speak louder than words.
Jesus riding a donkey into Jerusalem, and the whole John the Baptist situation. These are two things. They're not direct words from Jesus, but these are prophecies that it seems that he intentionally fulfilled to work into prophecies in the past. So it seems that he's trying to reinforce his identity as a Messiah by seeking out a donkey and riding into Jerusalem in that way. And also the John the Baptist, not words of Jesus, but saying that there's a greater one that will come after me. I'm preparing the way for him, right?
Okay.
And then also the King of the Jews plaque that was placed on the cross. This is something that most scholars trust, the King of the Jews on the cross. And it implies that he was not just a dissident that was arrested and crucified for that, but that his claims were blasphemous. And that is the reason that he was put on the cross. Because if he was just a dissident, if he was just, leading people around, they wouldn't have that messaging.
Okay. Before we get too much farther, I want to ask you about some of the stuff you just said. So about the fulfillment of the prophecies, is this just fulfilling like stuff that the Messiah would do, or is this something that God would do? Because there's a lot of like physical messiahs,
right,
ideas of that, and even like the Jews at the time, that's what they were expecting. They were expecting a political, physical Messiah.
Yeah,
and that is an idea that's still very prevalent in Judaism. So, in like modern Judaism. So,
yeah, there's a lot of references to messiahs, or in particular the Messiah being something beyond human. There was some religious or revolutionary leaders in the past that were referred to as messiahs, like this man named Bar Kokhba. He was in the past,
Kokhba, right?
Yeah, and he claimed to be the Messiah, but the Israelites at the time seemed to reject him because he couldn't express certain supernatural attributes. So all this on its own is not evidence to say that Jesus's Messiah is God. It does show that it's definitely something beyond just simple human leaders, right? And another point is that in Isaiah, he references that the Messiah is wonderful counselor, from the Messiah, wonderful counselor, almighty God, everlasting Father. And another point of evidence for this particular Messiah that Jesus claimed to be being something above prophets or kings actually comes in the parable of the wicked tenants, which once again, many of these evidences are focusing on verses that scholars have agreed with, and critical scholars who are, as you said, kind of demythologizing the Bible. These are some things that they do posit as authentic. So the parable of the wicked tenants, basically the premise is there's a master of a vineyard, right, representing the earth. And all the tenants of this vineyard are fighting, they're stealing, they're just not being respectful and loyal to the master, right? And the master sends waves of servants to the tenants to try to, find the error in their ways, get them on the right path. And the servants are killed. It doesn't work. And then what happens is the master sends his heir, his only son, or the son that's going to be the heir of his vineyard, to the tenants. And the son ends up, getting the situation all right. So Jesus told this parable, and the son is interpreted as...
Is the son killed in that parable?
Oh, yeah.
He didn't make it all right.
He didn't make it all right.
Killed.
The son got killed, representing his crucifixion. But Jesus told the parable. The son represents Jesus. And since the son is sent after all the other servants, he's higher up in the hierarchy. And you could try to say that the idea of the son was added to the parable after, but if you remove the son from this parable, the whole message, the climax of the parable was removed. So if you accept the authenticity of the parable, you'd have to accept the authenticity of the son, which seems to imply that Jesus as a Messiah is a step above the other servants.
Okay. So, yeah, he's the son of the master, which would be, I think that's non-controversial. Like the vineyard is Israel and the master is God.
Yeah.
But that Jesus is referring to himself as the son. So other places, there are other people who are, a son of God. Like in the Psalms, David is referred to as a son of God. So I guess what you're trying to say is that, like, everyone else would be like the servants. Like the prophets are like the servants.
Right.
Before. But the son in this parable seems to be very distinct.
Yeah.
It's like a different type of son.
And there's other evidence for this distinction between Jesus and any other lords, kings, leaders.
Son of God.
Right. Because when he prays, like the Lord's Prayer, when there's ever prayer in Scripture, everyone else, and he's told them to pray this way, everyone else refers to God as our Father who art in heaven, right? Mm-hmm. Our Father. But when Jesus prays, like in the Garden of Gethsemane, for instance, he uses my Father. It's a very personal, in the original language, it's a very personal, intimate,
Abba, right?
Different, right? Yeah. Different term. What else? Miracles. When Jesus performs miracles, it's not unprecedented for other people historically of this time to perform miracles. But when other people, when prophets, servants, the disciples, when they perform miracles, they pray to God to ask for the divine power to perform the miracle. But Jesus doesn't do it in the same way. He often just thanks God in that way. So it's just a different relationship between how he gets his power.
Okay, because other people definitely are given divine authority to do miracles or to do exorcisms.
Right.
But what you're trying to say is that Jesus was doing this on his own authority,
mm-hmm.
and he was just sort of letting God know and thanking him.
Right.
But isn't there verses where it's like my power comes from you or something? Or okay, let me ask you this: what about the verses where it's where Jesus seems to be submitting to the Father, where it's not my will but yours, or somewhere where it says I submit to the Father.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's verses like that, I'm pretty sure.
I mean,
let me see if you talk.
With the idea of the Trinity, that kind of gets into the Trinity and how the Godhead interacts with each other. So it's kind of hard to tell exactly what form that relationship is. But there are also verses that reference Jesus sitting on God's right hand and being a heavenly figure. Like Ezra is called up to be with God's Son in heaven, which implies that the title of sonship is something that is heavenly. And then there's a verse, I think Mark or Matthew.
Okay, I'm actually not sure if I want to push this, because the verse that I was thinking of is the Father is greater than I, which is in John 14.
Yeah.
But if I want to allow John, then I'm thinking, especially if I want to allow John 14, I think I'm going to run into problems.
Right.
A lot of scholars just sort of throw John out the boat, because it is later than all the other Gospels.
Mhm.
You know, it is the last one to be written.
Hmm.
So they're sort of like, well, it's probably got a lot of embellishment and stuff like that.
Hmm.
I think it is a genuine historical document. We can get stuff from it.
Yeah. That's another thing that people bring up, is that evidence for Jesus's status is kind of a legend being developed chronologically over time and increasing, is that the earlier Gospels tend to have less references to his divinity, and as the authorship gets later, it increases. But there are several texts, I think 1 Corinthians and Hebrews, very early on, some of the earliest Christian writings, and they also have clear references to Jesus as God.
Okay. So there's something that isn't there a prophecy in Malachi? There was something that I remember when I did my study of this. I barely remember it, but there is some verse in Malachi that I found very convincing. Some prophecy, and you mentioned it when you talked about John the Baptist. But what about? Is there one in Malachi?
Likely.
Likely. Okay. Well,
We can pull that up, maybe.
Well, it'll just be likely
Yeah.
for now.
Check out Malachi if
Check
you
out
want.
Malachi.
Yeah.
I think like chapter 3 or something.
Yeah, but the one that I find, the verse that I think really wraps it all up really well is, and the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But he was silent and made no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his mantle and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as a deserving death. And that's Mark 14:60-64. This kind of just shows all the titles we've been talking about, right? Christ, the Son of the Blessed, Son of God, and Son of Man. Jesus basically just claims that he's all of them at this point. And this does give us justification for why he was crucified, why he was killed the way he was.
Yeah, there's so much Christology in just that. This is a very dramatic scene, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about the Son of Man, this title.
Mm-hmm.
So there are 2 sons of man that he could be referencing. There's one in Ezekiel, which is like stand up, Son of Man.
Mm-hmm.
Let me show you something. God's talking to Ezekiel, right? And he calls him a son of man. There's also one in Daniel, where it is the Son of Man, which is sort of like this apocalyptic figure who is coming at the end times.
Yeah.
So I think it is fair to say that Jesus is probably talking about the
The
second
apocalyptic one.
Yeah. A, because he's using the definite article, the, as opposed to a.
Mm-hmm.
And B, well, he's coming on the clouds of heaven. That's what he says.
Right. It's
The
pretty
Son of-
clear. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also fair to say that he's referring to himself
Mm-hmm.
as the Son of Man.
Yeah.
And that this is probably...
Self-assurance.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
loads of times where he refers to himself as the Son of Man. Like, birds have nests to sleep in, but the Son
Mhm.
of Man has no place to lay his head.
Another thing is, sorry, this isn't completely related, but
You're
he power to forgive sins, and he seems to have a belief that people's salvation is somehow dependent on their belief in him. Those are 2 things that are also significant.
Yeah. That'd be kind
Anyway,
of weird.
continue.
That'd be kind of weird if you
That would
just
be
had
weird for just a random guy. to
divine
think,
authority,
You better
you know.
believe in me.
or you're going to die.
Yeah.
Also, it says that he's going to judge
Mm-hmm.
the living
Like
and
the
dead.
arbiter of,
Yeah.
of our sins, kind of.
And, in Jewish thought, that only God could do that.
Yeah, pretty significant.
Only God can judge me. That was a thought then
Mhm.
and now. And
Yeah.
Jesus is like, I'm going to judge you.
Right.
So,
Yeah. So, based on what we've talked about, there's a lot of evidence for Jesus' self-assurance as a Messiah, as a Son of God and the Son of Man. So, we're back at the trilemma, right? We're back at lunatic, liar, or Lord. And there's really no serious critic who tries to prove that Jesus was insane. One, all the historical records of him depict him as someone who is balanced, moderate, just a pretty normal guy, right?
well, yeah.
Yeah,
Not insane.
beyond just not normal in the sense of being God, but just not insane, right? And it's also kind of unprecedented for a madman to lead a spiritual movement, shape doctrines and moral codes that really, when you apply them to your life, only makes things better.
Yeah, it would be insane if, I mean, like, from what we know of psychopaths, they're not, like, that coherent.
Yeah.
You read the Sermon on the Mount, it's not a crazy person.
Mm-hmm.
No crazy person is writing that.
Yeah. And liar, the same situation. What purpose would it be to lie, to lead all these people on, if the moral guidelines and the lessons you're teaching them only make their lives better?
And, why would he, like, lie about being God? He got crucified for it.
Yeah.
Like, wait, there's been a
A
big
lie
misunderstanding.
A lie doesn't go that far.
No liar takes it to his, like, torture and death upon, like, the cross, which
Right.
is, very
Yeah. So
painful death.
So now we're kind of left with Lord. He fulfilled prophecy. He worked miracles. He led a spiritual movement that had great moral truths within it that could enrich humans' lives. And he rose from the dead, which is kind of the crux of Christianity and the other major thing that we're going to talk about today.
He rose from the dead.
Yeah.
Oh,
and that's the other main point of contention. So, Micah, take it away.
Yeah, so the resurrection, very important to the Christian faith. So his claims to divinity are also super important, but the resurrection is almost given special place. Paul, in many places, says that, like, you have to believe that Christ died and was raised for, like, the forgiveness of sins to be saved.
Mm-hmm.
And he hangs the truth of Christianity on the resurrection many times. So we probably should have gone over this when we were talking about his personal divine claims. But how does this historical inquiry work? So, the New Testament is a bunch of manuscripts. How did we get it? Well, we have a bunch of manuscripts of people writing at the time. More manuscripts of the New Testament, especially of the Gospels, than we have of any other biography or any other, like, work of the time.
Mm-hmm.
We have thousands of copies. It's, like, ridiculous. Some of them the earliest. Some of them very, very early. And earliness is super important for historical inquiry. If I record an event that happened, like, last week, if I write about it now, it's going to be more accurate than if I write about it 20 years from now. Because I'm going to remember it better. And it's more likely that I actually experienced the event. If an eyewitness writes something like 10 years after the event, it's way better than if some random guy who wasn't even there and heard it from hearsay writes about it 200 years after the event. Right? So a lot of the other biographies that we have around the time, like Julius Caesar or, like, Alexander the Great even, they have maybe, like, 3 sources that you only get, like, 200 years after
And we take them as truth.
And, like, the person who's, like, writing isn't even an eyewitness. And we have something radically different.
Right.
In the case of the Gospels, where the Gospels would be written, like,
a decade, like 5.
No, well,
not even that.
Dating the Gospels is kind of difficult, but typically it's placed after AD 69. So I don't think that that's entirely right, but that's where historians placed it, because that's when the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. There's a lot of very obvious predictions of that in the Gospels, so historians will place it after that, just because
to avoid the prophecy
being fulfilled. But there's a lot of stuff that makes them want to place it earlier. So, but they just can't. But anyway, These are very early documents, and we have a lot of them. So these are genuine historical documents that we can look for inquiry.
I'm curious, are there any historical documents outside of the Bible that attest to Jesus' resurrection?
To his resurrection specifically?
Right.
Not exactly.
Or phenomena around his resurrection?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Loads. I'm going to be citing, like, Josephus and Tacitus and stuff like that for some of the facts that relate to the resurrection. But anyway, when people are trying to determine historical validity of some event or some fact, they take these documents and they look for things in them. Because, some people, they lie in documents or they just make stuff up. This is very common in history. But there's things that we can look for to determine what actually happened. And they use this in court in, like, detective investigations as well. This is a very common These are very common criteria. First is multiple attestation. If you have multiple witnesses saying the same things, independent of each other, it's far more likely that they're telling the truth than if you just have one person who says it, right?
Right.
There's this multiplicative probability that things become drastically more likely because it's super unlikely. How would they invent the same story?
Yeah.
The same false story. It's way more likely that they're telling the truth. Dissimilarity. So if they have like no reason to make this up from their prior, if this isn't similar at all to what they priorly believed or attested, if there's a change, then it's more likely to be the case because you have to think of like, well, what could bring this change about except for the event in which they record.
Yeah.
The next is embarrassment. So if there's some fact that is embarrassing to record, it's more likely to be true because, you wouldn't just add an embarrassing fact just for nothing.
Yeah. Especially if you're going back. And yeah.
Yeah, if you're going back and adding stuff in, you're not going to add embarrassing details. The next one is context and expectation. So, if you're expected to write something, then that's not like, that's obviously not a point in favor of you. The next one is traces of culture and understanding. So when people write in a time period, there's going to be like things like idioms, turns of phrases, literal cultural details that only people within the sphere could know or did know. Like the Gospels show very intimate knowledge of like Jerusalem, just like the layout, the geography. Like there's bits where they say like we go down to Jerusalem or we go up to this place, and there's differences. Those are like correct differences of elevation. So we know that these were written by people who knew about the place, who were actually there. Or things like the names. So like the names are very accurate to the time,
Yeah.
that are like in the story. Next one is effect. So if something is like a historical fact, then it should have the proper effect. That kind of makes sense.
Right.
That would be anticipated of this historical fact happening. Lack of embellishment. If there's not a lot of like fancy schmancy details that are sort of added in, this sort of becomes like a super epic story. Like the Gospel of Peter, which is later, has a lot of those like super cool, like super epic details, like God's face coming out from the sky and being like, "My son has been resurrected," stuff like that. Next one is coherence with other documents. Make sure it's not disconfirmed by other accepted beliefs of history. And then the last one is historical congruence. So it's kind of like the traces of culture and understanding, where they doesn't make any historical blunders.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. So, how do you do this argument?
Yeah.
Well, you have facts, first of all. Relatively non-controversial, just historical facts that are accepted by critics, atheists, skeptical scholars, Jewish scholars. These are facts that are just accepted by pretty much everyone. And then from the facts, we look towards the explanations. So, the first one is that the tomb was empty. This is probably the most controversial of the facts that I'm going to be going over. But when I say controversial, I mean only 70% of critical scholars accept this. And that's from a study done by Gary Habermas. So while it is controversial, it's still very widely accepted.
I have a quick question about that.
Yeah.
I read that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul omits the empty tomb as evidence for the resurrection. And it seems like that's the most significant point of evidence. And if he was around the same time as all these other witnesses, you'd think that he would reference that. So why do you think that was left out?
Well, I don't know why Paul specifically omitted it, but I know that in 1 Corinthians 15, he focuses on the resurrection appearances. So he focuses on eyewitnesses.
So just less of a emphasis on that specific type of evidence.
Yeah, I think he just wanted to focus on the eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
And honestly, because he focuses on the eyewitnesses, that is a far less contested point. There's almost no historical scholars
that say people didn't see
think
it.
that like there weren't, or at least people didn't. Pretty much everyone says that people at least thought they saw Jesus. In several cases. But yeah, the tomb was empty. Still very important evidence. Just very quickly, there's multiple independent sources that confirm it was empty. That it was found empty by a group of women followers. So You've got the Markan story, which some people contest, but I think it's valid, and a lot of scholars just think it's valid as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have Luke and John probably have an independent source for their account. Matthew probably has an independent source because he has the guard of the tomb. So he's got some unique details. So he has probably a unique source.
Mm-hmm.
Second, this is probably a common thing most people have heard, is that the narrative of the empty tomb employs women.
Yeah.
So it's embarrassing, There's really, because of like how sexist the time was back then.
They weren't trusted as eyewitnesses.
They weren't trusted. There's no reason, if you're going to make something up, like the empty tomb, there's no reason to put women
You could
in the
use
story.
like Nicodemus or
Yeah, you
Joseph
could
of
use one of the other
Arimathea
disciples.
to find out the tomb.
In fact, later versions of the story often omit women. They just omit that part entirely because it just makes it look worse, But I mean, women aren't untrustworthy sources, right? That was just what was thought at the time. Enemies confirm the empty tomb. So the earliest polemic against the resurrection is that the disciples stole his body. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
It wasn't.
So
these guys are crazy.
That's the argument
this
they
dude's
chose.
bones are still there.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, the disciples stole his body. That implies that his body isn't there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So like, the Pharisees just sort of accepted that like,
he wasn't
his
there.
tomb is empty.
Mm-hmm.
We got to explain this somehow. And the disciples stole his body is just their attempt to explain it. So that's another criteria for historical viability.
Yeah.
Is if enemies confirm something, then it's probably true. Especially, I mean, this is kind of principal embarrassment. It's embarrassing for them to admit that the tomb is empty, but they sort of do. Also, the fact that Jesus was buried is probably, some people say it's the best established fact of antiquity. There's so many sources that confirm that he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. So many sources. So this was a public fact. Everyone knew where he was buried, right? And if everyone knew he was buried, it kind of proves the tomb was empty, because there's no way that Christianity could have flourished in Jerusalem, the city where he was crucified, when people could just go and look in his tomb.
Yeah.
And there's bones in there, or there's a person in there, So,
are you going to talk about what you make of the disciples stealing the body theory?
We'll get into that. You're going to talk more later when you get to challenge me with alternative theories for explaining this fast. I'll try to go faster. I'm sorry, I have a lot to say. The next one is post-mortem appearances of the risen Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So like you said in 1 Corinthians 15, he gives a list of people who saw the Lord. So Peter, and all critics agree that Peter saw Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
It's doubly attested. The 12, that's also pretty non-controversial. The 500. He lists the 500 brethren who had an appearance of Jesus.
Wow.
Which kind of seems like, out of the blue, right?
Yeah.
But there is some good reason to think that this is historically valid, because he says that these guys are still around to be questioned.
Mm-hmm.
So he's like, go ask these guys. You couldn't say that if they weren't around.
Mm-hmm.
That's a bold claim.
Right.
Like, some of these guys are still alive. Some of them have fallen asleep, but some of them are still alive. He is effectively saying, if you want to see if this is true, just go ask them. And so that's not really a claim you could make if it wasn't the case.
Yeah.
The next two are very impactful, which is James and Paul, who were opponents of Christianity. So James didn't believe in his brother Jesus. You can see that in Mark 3:21, 31 through 35, and John 7, 1 through 10. And that's an embarrassing fact, so it's probably not made up,
Right.
But it says that he was present for one of the appearances. That's one of the appearances that's not controversial.
Mm-hmm.
And later, it's very obvious that he's converted. Even extra-biblical source like Josephus, he writes that he was stoned to death for his faith in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, he is a rabid Sanhedrin member, devout Jew, persecutor of Christians, hater of Jesus, and someone who thought everything he was doing was right. He writes that, I thought I was blameless before the law.
Mm-hmm.
He had no gale about what he was doing, but he comes to believe and worship Jesus. And this is almost inexplicable unless you accept the account that he gives, that he had an experience of the risen Jesus. And so the conversion of Paul is also kind of non-controversial, that Paul converted, and that he had an appearance. So these appearances are doubly, sometimes triply attested. So like Paul, Luke, John, Matthew all have like these different accounts, and I hear popping. Sorry guys, we had to cut out. Started getting static on the microphone.
Yep.
We didn't want that to happen again.
Not again.
Okay, where was I? Oh right.
Paul. You were right after Paul getting
Right,
converted.
the multiple attestation
Yeah.
of the resurrection appearances. The last fact, just very quickly, origin of the Christian faith. These people, these eyewitnesses, very much did believe it. There's, it's almost historically certain that Peter, Paul, and James were martyred for their faith,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, you kind of are at a loss of how to explain, or that people really believed in the resurrection from very early on. You know, some people try and contest that people didn't believe that Jesus was God very early on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that we're sort of misinterpreting the seemingly high Christology in 1 Corinthians and stuff like that. But no one contests that there was no belief in the resurrection. The belief in the resurrection is like instant.
Yeah.
You know, and that's like that's the selling point of Christianity from the very beginning. Okay. So, I obviously have an explanation for these facts, but I want you to give me some alternate explanations. Let's see how they fare.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, obviously for the empty tomb, the one that you mentioned earlier was the idea that the disciples stole the body, hid it somewhere to try to convince people of his resurrection. So what do you make of that?
So this is the oldest of the alternative explanation of the facts,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the conspiracy hypothesis. Because obviously, if you have the disciples stealing the body, then they're in a conspiracy. You know, they're lying to people.
Mm-hmm.
They're deceiving other people. The problem with this one is it does explain the empty tomb pretty well, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't explain other things. So the postmortem experiences, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't explain them. They knew that, you know, that he was still dead.
Right.
And these weren't visions, mind you. These are physical appearances. In many places, they're implied to be physical. I mean, Thomas touches the wounds.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he eats with the disciples.
Yeah.
There's a lot of places where these are not like visions. These are physical things.
What if they were like hallucinations?
Well, they're physical. Hallucinations aren't physical. But there's other reasons why they're not hallucinations. We'll get into those when we talk about the hallucination hypothesis. But the biggest one it fails to explain is that their belief is genuine.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the facts was that their belief was genuine, that people were martyred for their faith. Like
Mhm.
Peter was an eyewitness, right? And who would have been one who stole the body, one of the ones who were stealing of the body.
Yeah.
If that was true. And then James and Paul, right? And, you know, people don't get martyred for lies.
Yeah.
They have absolutely no motive to make this lie up and also to continue it. And in fact, in Jewish thought, there's not even an idea of like a resurrecting Messiah that they could have gotten this from. In Jewish thought at the time, if your Messiah died, you went and you got another one.
Yeah.
You know? I feel like I'm going to sneeze. I did.
Get it out. Get it out.
So, yeah. So I guess that's why it would be improbable.
Yeah.
Which doesn't explain some of the facts.
So I could see the argument for all of the believers seeing God after, but why would he choose to primarily appear to people who already are waiting and believe in him? Why wouldn't he appear to some skeptics like Romans or just other people around who, you know,
So,
just more skeptics?
well, first of all, he does appear to skeptics. He appears to James, and he appears to Paul.
But these are people, I mean, they're maybe skeptical of the true nature of his mission, but they were close to him. So, I mean, you could feasibly say,
Paul wasn't close.
but wasn't that later on, not like directly after the resurrection? Wasn't that once Christianity was already kind of established?
It was like a year after or so.
Yeah. So like early on,
Even less.
the appearances right after the resurrection, even if they were doubters, they were still intimate with his message and his life's work. So why wouldn't he choose to appear to people who just didn't like him or agree with him or know him at all,
Well, okay.
like Romans, you know?
So if he appears, think of this. If he appears to just some random Roman soldier,
Mm-hmm.
what is this Roman soldier going to think? If he appears to someone who's just not familiar with him at all?
Well, I
He
mean,
lacks completely the context for what the appearance means. He's gonna be like, oh my gosh, it's Zeus.
well, presumably the Romans who are like in authority, or like the soldiers, would be aware of the crucifixion of this guy who claimed to be the Messiah, even if you're not, as I said, compared to the disciples who were following him along his life journey. So I feel like if Jesus appeared to people who were aware of his claims, but not necessarily associated with him, I feel like that would make a impact.
Okay, but here's the thing. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like well, I mean, again, I don't know why Jesus chose to
Appear
I
to
can't
who
say
he
for
does,
Sure, you
yeah.
know,
It's hard to tell.
It's hard to tell why God does most things from time to time, but again, it seems to me that if he appears to people who lack the context for
Mhm.
his vision, then they could get wrong ideas very easily.
Yeah.
They could get very quickly be influenced by pagan ideas or something like that. And if they have that appearance of the risen Lord, very often having an appearance of the risen Lord gave you a lot of authority in the early church.
Yeah.
So I would think that Jesus would maybe hesitate to give appearances to just
Just anyone.
anyone, because then they could, start proliferating false ideas that would be harmful to the church.
Yeah.
Because they just get the wrong idea.
So he wanted to make sure that his message was given to people who would actually understand and
Yeah, so
employ it to its full
he
capacity.
he doesn't mind appearing to like skeptics or
Yeah.
to people who don't believe in him, but he doesn't want to appear to people who don't know anything about him.
Yeah.
Because they might get the wrong idea.
Right.
It might not even be that helpful for them. But the other thing is that the 500 brethren that Paul is referring to, it could just be brethren in the present sense, like they are now brethren.
Yeah.
Doesn't necessarily mean that they, were all brethren at
Right.
the time of the appearance.
For all we know, those could have been skeptics.
Those
or
could have
people
just
that
been
were-
like random people.
Yeah.
It's not likely, but it does seem to be a gathering of like followers of Jesus.
Mhm.
But it's not necessarily that they were all.
Yeah.
believers
And 500
at
is a
that
lot.
time.
Skeptics or not.
Yeah,
So.
there could be like a hidden skeptic in there or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyway. Yeah, more theories. Give me more theories. Throw them at me.
So we talked about the empty tomb, which isolated can kind of be explained by the disciples, but not if these appearances are true.
Mm-hmm.
So the other main theory, hallucination, posits that these appearances were just hallucinations. So what do you say about that?
Okay, so the first problem is that these sorts of hallucinations break all of our psychological ideas of mass psychosis or hallucination, because people don't have combined visions. When people have visions or hallucinations, everyone's is different.
Yeah.
All slightly different. There's an example of people who expected the sun to move,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone there was a mass psychosis. Everyone there saw the sun move, but they reported it doing very different things. Some people saw it going side to side. Some people saw it grow immensely bright. Some people saw it going up and down. People have their own visions. The visions of the disciples are uniform.
Yeah.
And the visions of the 500 are also uniform.
We know that it says that all the 500 had the same vision, or is it just left like they also saw
Well, they
Christ?
saw Jesus. We didn't.
But how do
obviously,
we know
don't-
if that's like...
We don't have the specific interviews of them,
Okay.
but it's also kind of hard to have that many people. It's also mass psychosis is kind of hard, so it's kind of hard to give mass hallucinations.
Yeah.
Of even vaguely the same thing, and Paul again says you can question these guys; they're right there.
Yeah.
So presumably, all of them had the idea of Jesus. Obviously, we don't know that for sure.
Yeah.
But anyway. We also have no reason to think that they would have hallucinations, so grief hallucinations or something like that, because hallucinations sort of work on your present, your ideas,
Yeah.
of, what should be happening. But the disciples had no reason to think that, they were going to have, that Jesus was going to rise from the dead.
Right. They had a misconception of his whole...
Yeah,
mission up
they
till
didn't
the end.
understand. They didn't understand his prophecies at all.
Yeah.
And that's shown multiple times. But also, Jews did believe in a resurrection, at least the Pharisees, not the Sadducees.
Mm-hmm.
But they believed only in an eschatological resurrection, so a resurrection at the end of times.
Mm.
The idea that someone could resurrect, like, on Earth during the course of history was completely foreign to them. They didn't expect that at all.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and again, if your Messiah died, he wasn't the Messiah. You got yourself a new Messiah.
Yep.
That was the idea. So they have no reason to expect this. They're also not Greek. So Greeks didn't believe in the resurrection. Or, you know, the pagans didn't believe in the resurrection. But they didn't even have pagan ideas. So
Yeah.
it couldn't have come from pagan ideas either. So they really don't have any psychological model that would cause these hallucinations. It's kind of weird.
Mm-hmm.
The big thing, though, is that it doesn't explain Paul and James, who have doubly no reason to hallucinate,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're just, I mean, Paul didn't, I said he had no grief. He said, I'm blameless, you know. He has absolutely no reason to just have a hallucination, to have a vision.
Right.
And then B, it doesn't explain the empty tomb. The tomb is still there.
Mm-hmm.
So at the very best, you have to conjoin the hallucination theory with some other theory, like the wrong tomb theory, which has been shown to be very bad. It was abandoned like the second it was.
So you have to
as
just,
soon as it hit the floor.
just stitch random theories
You
together
have
to
to
make
stitch
sense
multiple
of.
theories together because I mean it only explains the appearances.
Yeah.
And maybe their genuine belief. It doesn't really explain the empty tomb.
Right.
Also, like I said, the appearances are written about seem to be physical.
Mm-hmm.
So like Jesus eats with them, cooks for them. He like invites them to touch him and stuff like that. And you know,
Yep.
it's not hallucinations don't have physical like manifestations. So you don't touch your hallucinations really. That doesn't really happen.
Yeah.
So that'd be also weird. Yeah. Well,
Well, we've talked about Jesus' self-assurance and his resurrection. So
and the resurrection is a vindication of
Yep.
his self-assurance.
it is.
He's like claims to be God. God raised him from the dead.
Mhm. And last episode we
So this
talked
guy.
about the evidence for God. So now we're really at the core of Christianity. And yeah, the next two episodes we'll be talking about the Bible and Adventist beliefs. But before we end off, do we want to do a quick Q&A?
No, I think we're all right for today.
Think we're all right?
I think we're all right today.
Because we could have
Oh,
a
well,
question.
actually,
Because I have a question.
you have a question.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I know in the Bible, in the verses, it mentions other saints rising from the dead during Jesus' resurrection. So what do you make of that?
Oh, are you talking about in John when it says like people rose from the dead and walked the streets?
Yep.
Well, I wasn't there. I don't know if it's historically accurate or not. Most historians don't count it as historically accurate.
Mm-hmm.
I think that theologically, people count it as accurate, but it's kind of weird. Like no one's talking about this,
Yeah, just kind of random.
So,
Whatever.
if it did happen, it probably happened like just somewhere where people weren't really around.
Yeah.
And John just sort of got that revealed to him. I don't have any problem with that.
Yeah.
John just sort of threw it in there. Not
Neither
really to
here nor
convince
there.
People, they're like, hey guys, this really happened. Remember when all those dead people got up and
Mhm.
walked around? That was weird, wasn't it? Also, people don't know they didn't know what Moses looked like. People weren't drawing paintings of Moses or the old patriarchs.
Mm-hmm.
He would just look like a guy walking down the street. Like
Yeah.
realistically, it's not really to be expected that people would be like, "Oh my gosh, that looks just like Elijah,"
Right.
So if it did happen, it's
Mhm.
not like people would. It's not like there would be an uproar necessarily,
Yeah.
unless they went around saying like, "I'm Elijah." But even if they did that, people would just think they were crazy.
Right.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't really, and we don't see a lot of evidence for other empty tombs either, do we? So
No,
Yeah.
clearly they went back.
right, like just want to see the light one more
Yeah,
time.
I don't. We don't really know what happened there. I think probably God included in the Bible for some reason. I may not know what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that happened, I guess.
Yep.
Not like, but we don't really need historical evidence for that fact.
Mhm.
That's not really my faith doesn't hang on that.
Right.
All right,
Is that about it?
that's about it. We
Yep.
could talk about the cope from historical scholars, because a lot of the times the question I get is, if the evidence is really this good, why don't more people believe?
Just because they don't want to. It just, I don't know.
Well, if the cope is insane,
Yeah.
there is so much cope. Myers' cope is actually like, it's kind of ridiculous. So, his idea is that like the resurrection can't be studied as a historical event because it didn't occur in time and space.
What?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a little crazy.
And he kind of gets into like Zeno's motion paradox, where it's like, because it was a transition from spatial to non-spatial, it doesn't count. We can't restore.
So he just doesn't want to talk about it. Essentially,
Yeah,
he's
he
like,
doesn't want to talk about it.
just talk to the hand.
Yeah, and Bart Ehrman is just like, well, in principle, the historian just can't study supernatural things.
Hmm.
And that's like, okay. So
Yeah.
the historian can give me the facts surrounding it, and the historian in their off hours, or I can just say,
Mm-hmm.
well, you know,
What do you think of
If
this, independently of your
yeah,
career?
as a philosopher, this is what
Yeah.
I think is the best explanation for that. You know,
Mhm.
there's this methodological constraint for, well, historians just can't do that.
Yeah.
Okay, I am a historian, not anymore, and now I just don't have that constraint, and
Yep.
now I can arrive at the truth, just as some other profession,
Yeah.
or just as some dude, you know?
Mhm.
So, yeah, just a lot of cope.
Crazy.
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 All right, that's it.
Goodbye.
Please don't come after us, Bart Ehrman.
Yeah. We'll talk about the Bible next episode.
Yes, we will.
Yeah. Remember, faith isn't blind.
Faith isn't blind.
Yeah.